If you're a student of political history, modern political history even, then you know that John Kennedy was the first and so far only Catholic to be elected President of the United States. But he wasn't the first Catholic to run for that high office. In this week's Real History piece, we look at the 1928 landslide loss of Democrat and Catholic Al Smith. His defeat was aided and abetted by willing surrogates of his opponent who were all too happy to use whatever means necessary to ensure his loss.
The election of 1928 can best be described as a contest that revolved around American prejudices and around American prosperity. By 1928, the United States had gone through roughly 7 years of seemingly unending prosperity. This is the first election where a Catholic candidate runs for the presidency of the United States. Herbert Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce in both the Harding and Coolidge administrations. He was a self-made millionaire, an engineer from Iowa, who was considered by many to be the most qualified candidate for the presidency in the 20th century. Al Smith was the three-term governor of New York in 1928 when he ran for the presidency. Smith had come up through the ranks of the Democratic Party in New York. He had worked with, although was not considered a member of, the Tammany Hall machine in New York City. Smith was the first Catholic candidate for the presidency of the United States, and he was a Catholic in a majority Protestant nation. Now in New York, that hadn't been as much of a problem, thanks to primarily New York City. But in a national campaign, it proved to be fatal to Smith's ambitions. By this point, not only did many Protestant Americans distrust Catholicism as a religion of un-American values that opposed democracy, that opposed tolerance, Smith's candidacy was an open sore for Protestants right from the outset of the campaign, because it was believed that Catholics owed some degree of loyalty to a foreign sovereign, that the Pope was not merely a religious leader, but he was also a secular leader who had attempted to interfere in international affairs throughout history. A significant proportion of the American public sincerely believed that if a Catholic was elected president, the Pope would come to the United States and rule from a fortress in Washington, D.C. After Smith's nomination, the attacks on his Catholicism began to increase and came from really three main areas. The first area was by scandal sheets such as the Fellowship Forum. The Fellowship Forum, the New Menace, and several other scandal sheets were disseminated to Americans to attack Smith's Catholicism and spread the idea that Catholicism was a direct threat to the United States. There was also open attacks on Smith by the Protestant press and Protestant clergy. One Protestant group published a manifesto stating that Smith represented an un-American threat to the United States. In a poll of 8,500 Southern Methodist ministers, only 4 stated that they would support Smith for the presidency, and similar numbers existed among Northern Methodists and Baptists and the Disciples of Christ. In addition to Smith's Catholicism, they went after Smith for his opposition to prohibition. Smith was not himself a significant drinker and was himself a very moral man. However, he felt that prohibition was a mistake. It was an un-American attack on a person's personal choices. For many, charges were interchangeable, that Smith was an agent of rum and Romanism. And for others, it was a way to cover their anti-Catholic bias. Smith couldn't come out and call people bigots because they might actually sincerely oppose him because of their belief in prohibition. So he could never quite make either the anti-Catholic charge or the anti-prohibition charge go away. One of the reasons that Smith's unable to deal with these charges effectively is the absence of a mass media. Without a very good radio voice, Smith had a hard time reaching the masses and convincing them of his sincerity. He could never quite convince the American people that being a Catholic did not mean that you opposed separation of church and state. I don't think Smith knew how to explain it any better than he did. For Protestants who were inclined to see Catholicism as a threat, they just flat out didn't believe him. Hoover personally did not get involved in any of this. Hoover stood aside and allowed it to happen, though. Hoover will win a massive landslide victory. he will get 5.5 million more popular votes than Coolidge did 4 years earlier. Hoover will also win several southern states that had never gone for the Republican Party in the post-Reconstruction era. In 1928, the state of Texas votes for a Republican presidential candidate for the first time in its history. In Virginia, in Florida, in North Carolina, the Republicans win for the first time since the heart of Reconstruction. Smith will win only 6 out of the former 11 Confederate states, the worst showing of any Democratic candidate in the post-Reconstruction era. Smith also lost his home state of New York despite winning in New York City. One of the most common jokes after Smith's defeat was that he sent a one-word telegram to Pope Pius XI saying, "Unpack." Smith, after the election, will seek the Democratic nomination in 1932, only to be defeated by his New York successor, Franklin Roosevelt. Smith never got over this defeat, bitterly criticizing Roosevelt and the New Deal throughout the remainder of Roosevelt's presidency. Smith eventually leaves politics and becomes a successful businessman in the 1940s. At the end of the election campaign, it was believed that a Catholic candidate was unelectable as President of the United States. And when a Catholic candidate is nominated again in 1960, John Kennedy faces many of the same questions and attacks. Indeed, Kennedy's relatively poor showing in 1960 is in part attributable to his Catholicism. Despite the Democrats having a 3-2 advantage in terms of registered voters in 1960, publicly Americans tend to say that religion isn't a major issue when it comes to voting for a candidate. However, it's hard to tell what an American's going to do behind the curtain of a voting booth.